Welcome.
Hi, I'm going to have my video off for a while I eat my lunch, but I'll be here.
Okay.
I'm heating up some soup, so.
Okay. Welcome. Glad you're here.
Yep, thank you.
Good morning, Jesse. Or good after, what is it? It's still morning for a few more minutes. Hi, Kyle. I'm going to unmute you. There you go.
Okay.
There you
right.
go. And
Good.
I just made you a co-host. So you know how to share your screen? It's at the bottom there.
Yeah, pretty sure I've done this before. Let me see. Yeah, share. We could put it on. All right, let's try to put the presentation on though. Let me see here. So if it's doing that, stop share. So let me try this.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So how's
Perfect. So you'll just want to hit slideshow so we don't see. There you go.
that? Now, what do you actually see? Do you just see the presentation then?
I'm seeing the presentation and your next slide. So
Okay. How do I get it on just the?
Display settings at the top.
Yeah.
I think you can choose. There you go.
Is that it?
That's it.
Okay, great.
So we're all set.
All right, cool. Let me see.
Let's stop the share for now
Yeah.
and then just come right back to this. Thank
Okay.
you.
All right. Let me go back here. Cool. How do I?
So it'll take a little bit for everybody to get on. We're only at 14 people. So I'll let you know when we're going to start.
Okay. Let me try to figure out how.
Well, welcome everyone. As we're waiting for folks to sign on, if you would please put your name and organization and email typed into the chat. This will help us to make sure that we know that you're here for continuing education. It helps people know who else is in the Zoom room, because with over 70 people registered, we probably will not be doing introductions. And it's just helpful overall. So if you could just take a few moments before we start to go ahead and put in your name, organization, and also your email. That way we know we can get in contact with you after the event.
Hello, Rebecca. This is Sherry.
Hi, Sherry. How are you?
Wonderful. How are you?
I'm good. I'm uh, looking forward to this a lot today. I'm excited about the topic. And
I am.
other than that, I'm also, it's a beautiful week. And yeah.
Yeah.
How about you? What's new with you?
Well, I am very excited about the topic. So yes. I had a mom go into preterm labor. She wasn't due until October.
Oh, no.
Delivered a 2-pound baby girl. So that's been a little needing attention.
Yeah.
But baby's doing okay for now, so that's all that matters.
Good, good. Well, I'm glad you're here.
Yeah. I'm gonna mute myself.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Yeah, just let me know when we're ready.
Yep, I will.
Okay.
Yep, we're up to 38. Give it just a couple more minutes and then we'll start.
For sure.
It's so nice to see some of your faces. There was some people I haven't seen in a long time. All right, so one more time, just going to remind people who've just joined us, if you could please put your name, your organization, and your email into the chat function. That helps us maintain our attendance records and also lets everyone know who's joining us today. We don't, with a big crowd like this, we don't have time to do our introductions, but we're so glad that you're all here. You have joined the Indigenous Women Wellness ECHO, part of a monthly series that is hosted by the Indian Family Resource Center. And Wayside provides technical support to help make all of this happen logistically. Today, our speaker is Kyle Hill, and he is psychologist and clinical training director at Indian Health Board, and he'll do more to introduce himself in just a bit. I want to remind you that after our event today, we'll be sending out an evaluation survey. It's very important that we get your feedback, but also that you complete that survey, because the last question is, I do need a certificate of attendance, or I don't. No, thank you. I don't need one. And we send them to those who indicate they do want one. So please be sure to complete that evaluation survey. If you have any difficulty, you can always email me. You've received a number of things from me in the email, so you should have that address. And let's see, any other things that I want to tell you? Oh, we'll close out, and if I think of it, oh, I know. If you have questions during the presentation today, if you could chat them in, write them in the chat, then I will help Kyle know that we've got questions, and I'll watch that for him, and we'll go from there. So welcome everyone. We're up over 50 people now. A few more people may join us, but I'm so glad you're here, and I'm going to turn things over to Kyle at this point. Go ahead, Kyle.
Thank you, Rebecca. How was you in Dinaway Maganadag? Manadugri was in Indigenous cause, Makwa and Dam, Mikanakwa, Juing and Dunjaba. My name is Kyle Hill, like Rebecca said. Currently the clinical training director at the Indian Health Board of Minneapolis. So just directing the training program for an APA accredited a psychology doctoral internship, as well as a postdoctoral fellowship. So staying busy, but I was just really excited to present on this topic and take this opportunity to just kind of share some things that I'm passionate about and I really enjoy. But as I said, just in my greeting, I'm enrolled in the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa or Ojibwe. I'm also a descendant of Sisseton-Wahpeton Oyate and the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribes. And I'm Bear Clan. And so yeah, and we'll get started. So today's presentation, I just kind of like piggybacked on this popular hashtag that's been going around with respect to kind of toppling of these kind of settler colonial folks, you know, and that we celebrate, but as a nation, as really globally, but you know, the sentiments by the Native community here and pretty much all Indigenous people is that, you know, they shouldn't be celebrated in the first place for a variety of reasons. And so I think it had me kind of just kind of considering what that means to us and what that means to me personally, my family, and historically about the health of nations and how we seek to reconcile, you know, a history of settler colonialism and what that looks like moving forward, and most importantly, how that ties into kind of contemporary issues of climate change, you know. And so, like I had just finished an MPH, and so that's kind of where this comes from. And I really was appreciative of kind of that line of work and that field to help me kind of connect the dots in a sense of where we're at as Indigenous people in terms of the health of our communities. But also, so I'm in my office, so I might get disruptions from the call. But the health of our communities, but also kind of the health of our environment, you know. So I do want to say, you know, if people could mute their lines, I'm hearing some feedback from my end. So if you could do that, that'd be great. So this is climate change and mental health in American Indian communities, and I'll get started. So just briefly, an overview, we'll start with land acknowledgement, and I felt that that was particularly important here. With this presentation, we'll discuss a little bit about climate change, the mental health impacts and burdens to Indigenous communities. Mostly, you know, the Native communities in the U.S., a little bit kind of about Canada and kind of their health disparities up there, and discuss a little bit about what settler colonialism is, colonization, the impacts on identity, mental health, and substance use, historical loss, and intergenerational trauma. Briefly, I know we have a lot of folks that have, you know this quite well and maybe even better than myself. Some of the current events and some remedies, challenges with evidence-based practice versus practice or community-based evidence. And finally, land-based healing approaches and trying to tie it all together. You know, the breadth of this presentation is pretty large. And, you know, as I was putting it together, it was pretty like unwieldy. And so I might kind of touch on a few topics more than once, but I'm hoping that it you know, doesn't reiterate the same points too much. So just to begin with, we are on Dakota lands or Dakota Makoche, and that's important to recognize for us here as, you know, me being Dakota, me being Ojibwe. And so when we recognize that we're on Indigenous lands, and particularly that of the Dakota and Ojibwe people, we have to understand the background and the history of where this land kind of, who the original occupants are, the original tenants and the stewards and stakeholders as Dakota people. And so here's a really beautifully laid out map by a local artist. So it gives the names of some of our sacred sites here. You know, and here we see, oh, let me actually share my screen. How did I forget that? Holy smokes. All right. So I don't want to go back, so I'm going to start here. Okay. Hold on. Display settings. Okay. Now, does everybody see that? Can I get a thumbs up? All right. So you didn't miss much. So the slides here, I went over the overview and the title. All right. So here, you know, we see like Bade Makaska. You can see some of the lakes as well as some of the other sacred sites that we have here. In the middle of the map, you see Badote, but you also see Fort Snelling here. And so the history of Minnesota, which is really Dakota for like a cloud-tinted water, right? So Dakota people were on this land for millennia prior to it being colonized, prior to settlers kind of invading this territory and stealing this land. And that came, you know, certainly in the way of Christopher Columbus, murder, rape, pillaging, and ultimately what we'll see in the 1800s and 1900s was the removal of people from indigenous lands, and particularly here in Minneapolis and St. Paul to South Dakota. And we'll get into a little bit more of how that's impacted our health. But here you see a map of where the indigenous nations were prior to and during like the early parts of colonialism and parts of, you know, colonization for the Americas. And you see that, you know, up towards Lake Superior was Dakota country, and Ojibwe country was up into Canada. And so we are on Ojibwe and Dakota land. So we need to really respect and recognize that, and also understand that our presence here, if you're non-native or from these nations, are one of as a settler. And I think that that has several implications, which we'll talk about in a little bit in a short exercise, but understanding how we could be allies to kind of reclaim, you know, projects, reclamation projects, cultural and language revitalization, and also cultural continuity. And so, you know, we see that map and we understand that, you know, lands were ceded, but we don't really get how this all happened. And so this is just a flyer that I found online, and it's really disturbing to me because it kind of shows you at least one part of the process here, you know. And so selling Indian lands, really not coming true with the, when they did form treaties, or they did form agreements to provide something, whether it was food or whether it was stipends in the form of money, that they were often unpaid, you know, and they were like, Native people were often misled in, you know, in forming these treaties. And so you see here that at this time in particular, you know, they were offering up onigum in Minnesota for sale, and in South Dakota, you know, Montana Crow Agency, North Dakota Fort Totten, Fort Yates, you know. And it looks like this was, I'm not sure if it has a year on it. Okay, 1911, somewhere around there. So at that time, we already had our reservations and removals. A lot of removals had already occurred. And so at this point, I think this is a map from 2014. So at that point, maybe there was like 566-ish federally recognized tribes, and now there's 574. So this may have changed. But you see, you know, from here and then going to here. And this is why we do land acknowledgements. So we recognize our place in this space and our responsibilities to the people that we serve, to the communities we live in, and how we can best kind of situate ourselves in our communities. So briefly, these are, with the land acknowledgement, these are just some of the treaties that were, that I could find. And so if you look on the right, feel free to read that. There are several treaties that really broke up and dismantled the native communities, that the Dakota and Ojibwe people that were here. And so when you guys get these, I hope you're able to get those links on PDF. But if you do want just a PowerPoint with these links, I think it's a really helpful opportunity to educate yourselves on what actually happened with all of these treaties. So we'll move on a little bit. And so as one of the architects of kind of land cession and really lies in creating treaties and hurting and kind of erasing native nations and communities and history from this area was Alexander Ramsey, and it's hard to go around and see Ramsey County and other things like, Sibley Street or something like that. And so this is where the naming comes in, right? Renaming and reclaiming these sites and is, and it's not a small thing for us. I think it just goes to identifying like the original state of this place. And so you could see that this, at Alexander Ramsey, so at one point he was the governor of Minnesota, says, "It was our constant aim to do what we could to break up the community system among the Indians and cause them to recognize the individuality of property. If timely measures are taken for the proper location and management of these tribes, they may at no distant period become an intelligent and Christian people." And later, it says, "The Sioux Indians of Minnesota must be exterminated or driven forever beyond the borders of the state." So, if you have even a cursory knowledge of history, right, we understand that this, Sioux versus U.S., like this Dakota War of 1962, really, I guess, I want to say like eroded into this, and that was because of famine, it was because of hunger, it was because of loss. And so what that really eroded into was the development of, Fort Snelling, and Dakota people were put in an encampment right over there by Badote on the confluence of the Minnesota and the Mississippi rivers, and they were watched over, right, by Fort Snelling. And they were eventually moved via the Mississippi River and other ways to like Crow Creek Reservation. So this is when like Sisseton was developed. This is somewhere allowed to stay. So that's why we have Prairie Island. That's why we have the Minnewakanton Band of Dakota. But many of us, I myself are from Sisseton, South Dakota. And so, and there's a lot of problems that come with this as well. I know that recently they were trying to reverse a court ruling that exiled Dakota people from the state of Minnesota, and that was essentially, they didn't allow that to pass. Now, I'm not sure, I don't have the specifics, but it's super sad. So, and it's really hurtful, and there's a tremendous amount of grief from that. And so that's what we're presenting on today. What does this all mean? How does this all affect Indigenous people? And how do we remedy this as a community? But first, going from the land acknowledgement, moving forward, talking about different topics in history, I think it's important to also address the fact that, we're not, like, Native people have the burden of having to redress history. A lot of us are not historians. I'm a psychologist, right? And so, but knowing our history is vital not only to who we are, but also to come back and like reclaim culture, reclaim language, and reclaim like this relationship to the land. But in doing this presentation, what I realized is that it's a little bit deeper than that. It's almost like when you're have been oppressed as a person, the knowing your history is a burden that you cannot afford to forego or forsake. Whereas I think for like settler communities or white folks, you can afford to have this historical amnesia, and that's a luxury of sorts, right? Because if we allow ourselves to forget, if we allow our history to be forgotten, then that's not only painful, but it can be quite like calamitous, and I guess invite other insults and assaults and possibly, you know, into another genocide. So I found that particularly like profound to me as I'm like thinking about this, and what this means is that people of color, whether it's Black or brown folks, always have to know history and teach it to non-people of color, like non-BIPOC or BIPOC communities. And that's my observation of how that felt from like this phenomenological or perspective, my own perspective. So what we're gonna do right now is a location exercise. So if you don't have a pen and pencil handy, if you could go and get yourself one and maybe something to write with, or just think about it. And we're gonna move forward with this. And so right now, we're probably having some emotions, some thoughts, you know, and I just want us to notice those and do this writing exercise for about 5 minutes. And so what I'm going to do is start my little timer here. Put it at 5 minutes. We could take longer. This is not a strong 5 minutes. So what I want you to do is, with this location exercise, the object here is to just basically recognize who we are in this space and where we came from. Not only physically, but cognitively, you know, emotionally and spiritually. And so what I want you to ask yourself and answer with your piece of paper is who, how, and where am I, right? So begin by just your race, your ethnicity, your heritage. Where are my grandparents, grandparents, great-grandparents from? Have I ever been to my home country if you're not from North America, or Unchimaka, or like Turtle Island as we refer to it? Would I ever consider going home and staying in my country if you're not from here, right? And how did I, or they, or we get here? Was there a reason we decided to come? Or was there a reason that we decided to immigrate, to leave the home country? And what privileges allowed me to be here today? Was it education? Was it money? Was it a car? Was it childcare that I had that other people don't have the privilege of having? Was it my health? I was able to walk or bike to work, right? So in this physical space, in this online space, what privileges allowed you to be here today? What relationship do I have with the space online? You know, is it because this is the work that I do? What relationship do I have with this place, Minneapolis, Minnesota, right? You might say, oh, I'm from the country. Maybe I'm from Crookston, Minnesota. But I moved here after college and I really love this place, and I'm raising a family here. What knowledge do I bring to this work, and where does this knowledge come from or originate, right? Where is this knowledge from? Textbooks? You know, is it knowledge from, maybe you're a practitioner, so maybe you practice CBT, you know? So where does Aaron Beck come from? If you practice, you know, psychodynamic approaches, where does Sigmund Freud come from? You know, if you're any number of those, you know, maybe you practice DBT, where does Marsha Linehan come from? You know, where does this knowledge come from? You know, and how did they get it? And do I impose this knowledge on other people? Do I use this knowledge to change how other people think, feel, or behave? And yeah, that's basically it. So I'm going to start the timer, and you guys have had plenty of time to already work on this. So I'm going to leave you alone for 4.5 minutes.
Hey, Kyle, we have one quick question. When you say home country, are you referring to where the person was born or where their ancestors came from?
Where your ancestors came from. Yep. Good question. So you have about 2 minutes left. All right, 1 minute, if everyone can start wrapping up. Okay, I hope everyone had a chance to finish this. Yeah, this is sometimes a sobering kind of exercise, but I think it is also really important to understand how we're entering into spaces. And so location and positionality are very important in this work with Native peoples, to understand how we're getting here, how we're coming to this space, and how we're entering a space and who we're entering it with, you know. So I think, you know, cognitively, it helps us to really understand like our relationship to where we are, but where we came from. And also, in my experience, it kind of raises the level of empathy and concern for who you're entering, you know, a space with. Yeah, especially if you're serving clients, or maybe you're in, you know, child protection, or you're working at a university or something like that. You know, it helps you understand like where is everybody else coming from. So I hope everybody found that somewhat useful. And so just revisit this and think of this as we continue through this presentation. So now we'll be going into a little bit of climate change and Indigenous health. And I shared with you, I'm definitely not a historian, but I'm definitely not like a geologist, oceanographer. You know, there's some really special people that study this stuff. And so I'm just going to skim the surface. So first, I just wanted to start with a bit about kind of social determinants of health and what Native people, Indigenous people experience in North America. And so just briefly, I mean, on a daily basis, and what we deal with is, as Native people, is lower life expectancies, you know, and here you have numbers from both the US and Canada. And, you know, this is in comparison to non-Indigenous populations, all other races, higher unemployment rates, lower incomes, and poorer educational attainment of high school diploma. And so some of the disparities in the psychiatric profile is where we have a disproportionate burden of post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety disorders, you know, and there's mixed evidence on the depressive disorders, but I think most importantly, from what I understand about depression in American Indian communities, is that it's difficult to, I guess, conceptualize in relation to some of the instruments that we use to measure it. For example, the PHQ-9, right? The reason I like the PHQ-9 is because it has a critical item, number 9, that asks, you know, a subjective report on suicidal ideation, which, you know, I don't think the Beck Depression Inventory has. However, like, neither of those ask a question about loneliness. And so if you were to kind of take kind of a deep dive into the literature on what the manifestation of depression in Native communities, you would come across like some authors that study loneliness. And so, you know, we tend to maybe diagnose depression, you know, with a certain number of attributes or a certain number of symptoms over a 2-week period and stuff like that, but it doesn't have loneliness in there. And so that's one, I think, factor that is not really captured very well in the literature and research and stuff like that, but as a practitioner, we always have to be mindful of, you know. And certainly when we think of, and to add to this, of course, is suicidal ideation and suicide attempts, suicide completions. And so when we think of kind of suicide, which I think I touched on a little bit later, you know, some theories, especially the interpersonal suicide theory of suicide, you know, there's kind of 3 areas that you want to look at to recognize as really, really severe red flags. So if people are experiencing, you know, these 3 feelings or sentiments, it means they're at high risk, right? One is acquired capability. So if they have attempted suicide in the past, they have acquired that capability. That fear no longer interrupts or disrupts their attempts. They've done it. They're like, I can do this again. This is no problem for me. Right. Another one is perceived burdensomeness. Do I perceive that I'm a burden to my family and loved ones? And another one is thwarted belongingness. And I think that gets at the loneliness piece a little bit more. And so I don't think it's a coincidence that we have higher suicide rates than Native youth at this point in time, and we have for quite a long time. And so thwarted belongingness is, I don't feel like I belong here in my family, in my community, and stuff like that. And so with that, I think, something to take away is, if you have clients that are expressing any of these, and of course with acquired capability, you can see that in their chart, that from their history and their psychosocial profile. And so, that's particularly important to kind of look at. And of course, substance use disorders really kind of is a variable that plays in there as well. I mean, most adolescents that are attempting suicide are under the influence of substances, and especially males. And so more critically, I think in males, the suicidal attempts are more often fatal than they are in females. So I think these are all issues that we see in relation to these kind of social determinants of health, poverty, lack of opportunity on our reservations in our urban communities, that we kind of spiral and can end to, unfortunately get to a point where we're, considering not wanting to be here, if we're thinking about our clients and our community members. And of course, like comorbidities are also very important to be attuned to. We experience disproportionate rates of diabetes, obesity, again, substance abuse, suicide, unintentional injuries. A lot of times suicide are kind of couched into unintentional injuries or poisonings, cervical, kidney, and liver cancers. So this could be, I think, a presentation in and of itself. And so just briefly, talk about social and ecological determinants of health, and so let me get this smaller. So populations at risk of adverse consequences due to global warming at this stage, are disadvantaged and vulnerable populations, whether that's going to be infants, kids, people of color, indigenous peoples, local communities dependent on agricultural or coastal livelihoods, marginalized groups based upon social and environmentally mediated factors, so this is those of lower socioeconomic status. Gender, has a kind of some things to do with this. And I think in particular with Native communities, when we come from hunter-gatherer kind of collectivistic cultures, we'll get into a little bit more, but I think that's where it's particularly salient for our, for our communities, for all of the Native nations in the US and Canada. And of course, communities that really depend more on agriculture, depend more on farming and stuff like that. Also, unemployment, or underemployment. And right now during COVID, this is especially an issue. Undereducated, that's a big issue. How do you educate yourself? Do you have the tools and capacity necessary to operate kind of internet? Do you have internet? All these things play a part in our resilience to climate change, but also our ability to adapt to climate change and mitigate, ongoing issues. And so the social determinants of health is really the conditions under which people are born, grow, play, live, and work. But also, we have to consider where people pray, and I think that's kind of falls in line with the social and cultural determinants of health. And so, you know, some of the literature we'll talk about later is like cultural connectedness, you know, and so culture becomes a determinant of health, especially when you go through a period of colonization and have those feelings of historical loss or grief from not being able to practice your traditional culture or know anything about it, you know, or not know anybody that knows anything about traditional culture or ceremonies or practices. So some of the risks to native, hold on. Okay, some of the risks to native nations is, and frameworks for climate-related health impacts recognize that indigenous communities are at risk due to their dependence on land, traditional lifestyles, and culture and food systems. So this includes food and water insecurity. And so when I think about like Navajo Nation or the Dene Nation in Arizona and New Mexico, much of the risk that is being kind of elevated is because they don't have access to running water, right? And from my experience, some tribal communities and families in South Dakota don't have access to running water and have to go and haul their water from, you know, a nearby community. So if we think of, you know, COVID, we have to go to a more densely populated community and go and, you know, fill a water drum, take it back home, and then ration that water. You know, that's pretty scary to think about. And I think there are some community organizations and universities that are helping Navajo Nation really kind of negate that risk by helping with food or water stations and providing meals and stuff like that. So some of the climate-related risks that we're seeing in the U.S. and Canada is, you know, melting sea ice, you know, and much of the research that I've seen, which is very little in the U.S., which is kind of terrifying, is from Alaska. And so it's from like Inuit communities up there. And so I'll share like a quote in a little bit, but you know, some of the concerns is, you know, how do we live? How do we live if we have sea ice melting that's affecting our, you know, lived environments and our ability to hunt or ability to fish? And also, you know, one of the more concerning things is an erosion of feeling like you can't rely or trust your indigenous knowledge, you know, traditional knowledges that have served these people for, you know, millennia, to be able to convey that, to say, hey, I know where you can get this food. It's across this like ice land sea bridge or something. But when that is eroding, when that's melting, like you no longer trust that. And you can't like tell someone like, oh man, there's this, you know, this is where we get food. And so questioning that, I think, is, you know, as we'll kind of come to find out, is really questioning our being and who we are as Indigenous people, because we share such a intimate relationship with the land, right? Rising air temperatures and surface water temperatures, extreme precipitation events, hurricanes, flooding. You know, I grew up in North Dakota and Wisconsin, but in Grand Forks, like there's a flood, it seems like every year, right? And the Red River floods, and, you know, in 2008, I believe, there's a huge, you know, massive cleanups. And so, but then we think about like Hurricane Katrina, how many people were displaced? What type of trauma and grief did that result in? And then smaller average winter ice extents are problematic in Minnesota. And so I share a couple pictures, I think in the next couple of slides here, about what that actually means. And also, you know, that Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge is helpful to mitigate and adapt to climate change. And obviously without this, or when this is questioned, as in, you know, the melting sea ice, there's a huge risk here. And I think When we think about historical trauma or loss, and erasure or termination or assimilation, if we don't have this traditional knowledge, of course that's a risk, right? We don't know how to exchange, how to live and work and relate, in the ways of our ancestors. So factors affecting adaptation. And really, when you look at like this climate change and mental health research and climate change stuff, they talk about like, we're in this period called the Anthropocene. And so it essentially means that all of the changes to climate in this era are related to human behavior. And so they'll, as I read it, they'll say, well, during the Anthropocene, or the Anthropocene is, this is the experiences we're having, or this is what we're seeing. But the strengths of nations and tribal nations to adapt to the current era, or adapt to the current climate change issues, is, again, traditional knowledge of land and resources, cultural identity, and social and kinship networks. But on the converse, some of the adversity that we see is the institutional and structural racism, whether it's social, economic, or political, that keep people from either practicing these ways, identifying with it, or we don't have the resources to be able to get to the places we need to do, or to access the knowledges we need to, and to learn in the ways that, we need to learn how to do these things. Of course, socioeconomic poverty, disenfranchisement, lack of legal land title, globalization, oftentimes, a lot of our traditional foods this will occur, or, this affects other indigenous communities. And I remember, this makes me think of a time when I was in this public health class, and there was a physician from like Chile. And so, we were in a group, and we were talking about, I think we were on a break. And I remember she was talking about taking a class on wilderness and tropical rainforest medicine. And, she was telling the class about how she's being protected by this community because she's one of the only doctors. And so she was, in some of these communities, one of the foods that is a traditional food is quinoa. And so this is a few years ago, but I remember like I was eating a lot of quinoa at the time, and just thinking, I was like, whoa, like how is quinoa in, that part of the world? Like that's your traditional food. And so what she said was that it's being like, because of globalization, basically that quinoa was no longer affordable to even the people that were farming it or harvesting it and stuff like that, because it was, and so much of it was going to the US, to all these industrialized countries that could afford it, and obviously prices went up. So it really priced them out of their own traditional food system, and I think that's, to some extent, that is, I'm sure, is on the minds of folks who are really on the ground and in their communities doing like harvesting for wild rice, or monomen, and other things, and we think about like, this is time for picking berries, so that may be something that is on the minds of people too. And of course, weakening of traditional knowledge systems and social capital, and this is just a history of assaults on self-determination and sovereignty and cultural discontinuity. There's a comma there. I might have not finished that. So, and I think, for our purposes here in what I consider is probably one of the most difficult things to work with is, as, an indigenous or native person of Dakota and Ojibwe, like, being from these communities, is that I come at this work with a limited amount of knowledge, you know, because I've suffered or I've experienced the same assaults in some way, whether that's, you know, historical trauma or thinking about the loss on a daily basis that my ancestors underwent and now I experience, right? And so it's almost like, you know, despite being educated, we also have this, at the same time, we have to confront and, I guess, navigate and hopefully resolve our own insecurities related to these issues that our people face. And so to me, I think that's one of the most overwhelming, I think, concerns that is, that complicates my ability to progress and move, and really realize this on a day-to-day basis. All right, so this is a bit of like some pictures on climate change in the Great Lakes, you know, and so you can see Lake Superior up here, and so really the surface water temperature is increasing, and the map shows a bit about the rate of change in Fahrenheit per year, you know, so you can see on Lake Superior, it's really kind of the highest up in Canada area. And, you know, going into this a little bit, what I realized is that this is having an effect on like the seasonal ability for ice, the seasonal like ice extents. So ice is not, you know, forming until later, and it's melting quicker. And so what does that mean? It's kind of like, you know, if you're wearing a black shirt versus a white t-shirt, right? We wear a white t-shirt in summer because the sun, you know, it reflects the sun. Whereas when we wear a black t-shirt, we absorb the sunlight. It's the same with our lakes. And so if we have ice and if we have snow, it reflects the sunlight. Therefore, the Earth's surface does not get as warm. It doesn't absorb as much, you know, so therefore less warming. If the lakes are open for longer, it absorbs that heat and it stays on the Earth's surface. So you have more warming, right? And so that's a huge issue, right? And I know, you know, that like glaciers and stuff like that, they help trap like CO2 and stuff like that, like gases that are very critical, like greenhouse gases and everything. So again, you know, this is not my field, but it's important to me. And the more I learn about it, the more I feel like this is critical for us to at least acknowledge in this work that we do. And here it is right here, you know, this is the ice cover. Trend in days per year, duration of seasonal ice cover is decreasing in most areas of the Great Lakes. So yeah, and just kind of doing some reading about this. I mean, it's just wild to think about. Like some of these, it's hard to wrap my mind around some of the numbers. You know, like I was reading something that said like there's like 15,000 lakes in, you know, the U.S. that were covered with ice at different periods of the year that now like are for very minimal or small periods, but are not at all, you know. So it becomes like very problematic, like these things, and especially like regulating the seasonal cycles of whether it's like biodiversity or whether or not that's like, you know, fish spawning, or whether or not it's like, who knows, maybe it affects like the ability of things like wild rice or monomen to be able to you know, for us to, you know, have that cycle. So yeah, either way, you know, it's just lots, you know. So the effects of climate change on mental health, that's of, not if. And so the ecological systems change have impacts on grief and mourning, and this has been termed like ecological grief. So it's grief felt in relation to experienced or anticipated ecological losses. Loss of species, ecosystems, and meaningful landscapes due to acute or chronic environmental change. And so there's three kinds of losses that are mostly relevant with respect to ecological grief. It's grief of physical ecological loss. So I lost my land. I lost, this lake. I lost these physical aspects. Disruptions to knowledge identity, which I think is particularly important for Indigenous people in our communities specifically. And then anticipated loss. And so, in previous kind of work, they identified some of this as, interestingly, I forget when it was, but they talked about it as kind of this, like, not a disorder, but this, I guess, a dis-ease, and it wasn't a disease. It's just this problem called like solastalgia. And so, it was like, I've lived in my community, but things are changing, and that makes me very uncomfortable in a way that I feel sick. Right? So if you're on the same lands, let's say you have a home and you see the industrialization of your community, and perhaps you see littering and all that stuff, and degradation or whatever of the forest, of the landscapes, of the water. Maybe your water doesn't produce wild rice, or maybe your fish are contaminated. I think that's when that would bring that ecological grief, or the solastalgia, what they called it back in the day. Like, these are all issues that we have to be cognizant of for ourselves, but also the people that we work with. And so extreme weather events or acute events, or loss of ecological systems, can trigger like PTSD, vicarious trauma, major depressive disorder, anxiety, complicated grief reaction, survivor guilt, substance abuse, and suicidal ideation. And so we think of like acute as like a flood or a rainstorm or a tornado or something like that. But like, what's happening now is that we're looking at more distal kind of issues, which is, global warming. And we can't really comprehend that because we don't feel it with the same acuity as we do a flood, so deploying something like Red Cross or something for global warming is kind of a strange thought to us, on like a human level, because it's like, how do we know when it gets bad? Or how do we know when it's bad enough? Or how do we know when it's irreversible, right? So I think that's why prevention becomes, the biggest issue. And so with respect to ecological grief, like, this is just one quote that I took from, this author, is that, studying in Alaska with the Inuit populations, and they have a good amount of research out there, the Inuit people, this is from a community member, and so the community member said that Inuit people are people of the sea ice. If there is no more sea ice, how can we be people of the sea ice? Simple, but so disturbing on like a spiritual level, right? And so talking a little bit more soon about Indigenous identities and how we see ourselves as existing, like this tribe in particular see themselves existing as a people of the sea ice. And so with global warming, what kind of, and the sea ice disappearing, like what kind of disenfranchisement must that feel like? That lack of belongingness, the lack of identity, the lack of being, like, who are we? Like, who am I? And that's, to me, is, I think, so, it just speaks to something that is so important to address. So again, it's a disruption to sense of place and connection to land, and related to like a loss of environmental knowledge and identity. Like, and for us as Indigenous people, our Native people, is that identity is constructed in relationship to the land, its use and knowledge of it. And so here, I think what we find and I think feels so emergent and acute in relation to kind of COVID is that this both disproportionately affect our elders, right? Where they're like the knowledge keepers and knowledge holders for our communities. And how do we keep them safe? And how do we collect this knowledge? And how do we hold that, you know? So you see that as Native people, we're in kind of a double bind right now, you know, and this is a really difficult time. But, you know, we see some kind of research done with respect to historical loss and depression in adolescence. And what that showed is that adolescents think about historical loss a lot, like weekly. Think about the loss of land. They think about the loss of culture, the loss of songs. They think about, you know, all of that, loss of spirituality. And so this isn't, you know, specifically around, you know, anybody along the lifespan. I mean, this goes across kind of developmental trajectories. Like, people know that there's been loss. People know that there's been hurt and insult to their communities and to their people. So a bit, you know, how do we address climate change as Indigenous communities, as a community here? And what does climate justice or climate resilience look like? Well, you know, number one is articulating Indigenous conceptualizations on and approaches to health and championing those efforts, you know, helping revitalize that. And in this community, maybe it's helping someone, you know, go home to their reservation or identify people who are safe that they can learn, like traditional ways or customs or beliefs, or help them learn how to do these things, right? And so that in and of itself is going to take like a stepwise process. Also, an interdisciplinary collaborative approaches and active engagement with tribal communities to recognize Indigenous knowledges alongside Western scientific approaches, right? Because if Western science got us here, you know, I mean, I don't think it's the way out. So, you know, it's sad because all the time we see that, you know, when I'm on social media, we'll see something pop up that says like, oh, you know, this scientist just discovered that, you know, this medicine can help resolve a cold or a flu, or helps, you know, cleanse something. And it's like, you know, we know that, you know, we've been knowing that. So, you know, the issue is that a bridge between communication, but also like all of the plant medicines here and in these communities, people knew, you know, people knew those. They lived according to what the land gave them. And they, you know, there was a very robust empirical process that Indigenous people used prior to like the arrival of, you know, Euro settler communities, you know? And so again here, leverage and build on sociocultural strengths, developing strategies to affect change on root causes of vulnerability. And here vulnerability in both climate change and Indigenous health, you see, is these, the ideologies and settler colonialism, right? And so how do you begin to reverse that and redress that experience, and to be able to, I guess, you know, bring back or, you know, prevent any more illness or damage or problems, and it's like bring us back to a place of health, you know, whether it's the environment or Native people. And so you see how both Indigenous communities and the land, you know, are experiencing illness or, you know, problematic events at the same rate, at the same time, and it keeps on happening. And if you look for it, you can see it. So enhancing climate-related health risk management strategies, policies, and programming, that seems like it's always there. So, you know, just a bit to go into it more specifically, about like indigenous worldviews, you know, and I think this is where we get into the meat of what we're talking about here, is that these are ecocentric in a sense that, you know, we believe that self and personhood focus on place in creation, right? It's really that we're not above any animals or the environment or anything like that. We very much exist in relationship, and we're the same, right? One and the same, just organisms, just beings on the planet, one and the same. And we have to, you know, so I think just that very basic teaching, and, you know, is something that's pretty profound, and it can lend a lot to, you know, how we're taught to behave in Western, you know, in Western institutions, you know, when there's such a kind of, I guess, a focus on individual excellence, you know, and stuff like that. So, but also these cosmocentric beliefs that we are understood to exist in relationship with like celestial systems, with the stars, you know. And so this is how indigenous people, or at least Ojibwe and Dakota people, were able to see like, now it's time to do this. Now it's time to plant. Now it's time to harvest. Now it's time to do this. You know, if the, now it's time to hunt. Now, you know, so there is a very much, like I said before, like empirical approaches, observation, like things we learn in like, you know, 8th grade chemistry class or 7th grade biology is like, you know, how do you compose a study, you know, a very big, what's the scientific process or scientific design? It's like, you know, so not only do we not recognize traditional knowledge as being parallel to Western knowledge systems, we also actively kind of undermine it, right? So I think, again, this is probably at the root of the issue here. Identity is focused on the collective, family, community implications, and this has implications on how stress and trauma are conceptualized, right? So we don't conceptualize stress as just happening to one person, right? Stress and trauma happen in relation to other people, by community events, historical events, right? And so in a sense, we're tied to our ancestors. Now, in other communities, that's not the case. It's very much here and now. What happened to me, you know, I can do it, right? It's all about me. It's very egocentric. That's not who we are as Native people. So we can appreciate Indigenous frameworks for health and relationship. And, you know, what I like to look at is like a very simple kind of tool that I use, and we use it here in training a lot. And I appreciate this, is the medicine wheel for understanding like so many things, you know, is human development, seasons, health and illness, right? But also kind of we're guided by our oral histories, our traditional stories, and you can see some of these things in the artwork that people compose, or people, you know, the pieces that people create. And so just briefly, this is, you know, I'd use this to just start out like a group that we're starting here. But within this medicine wheel, you see like the 4 directions, and this is meaningful in the sense that it helps us understand like the lifespan development and developmental trajectories. You know, on the west or on the east, you see like we talk about youth. In the south, it's like adulthood. On the west, it's like middle-aged adulthood, elderly, and in the north, it's like that's where people leave this earth, right? But it's a cycle. And so within that, embedded within that, you see like a social ecological, like Brofenbrenner's model that I like to use. So it's not so much just individual. We also think about like, how does this affect not only me, but my family, my community, and society, and what impacts are coming from all those spaces, right? And so I think, you know, there's just so many ways. And I wanted to, a friend of mine who did a lot better job at, you know, she's helping me with the drum group, but she was able to use like PDF Creator or something like that to create a lot more like technically sound medicine wheel with words and all this stuff. But to me, like, I can understand a lot by just looking at this and utilizing this to, I guess, inform like treatment approaches. Like I use it like in case conceptualization. We train around this in our trainings, but then when I also think about spirituality and culture and stuff like that, this helps me organize like myself around this, and even self-care, like thinking about how like the mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual parts of us, how we need to practice self-care in those ways on a daily basis to achieve balance, right? Because the medicine wheel is just about balance. And so that's just a basic, like, you know, I guess teaching about the medicine wheel. So going back to this is like land, like the history, sorry, I keep on leaning on my table, so I have a stand-up desk. So the history of land dispossession, displacement, and removal during periods of colonization, like prohibited us from practicing our traditional life ways, including subsistence methods, and that really affects our identity today, you know. And it takes a lot of initiative and humility to be able to go out and really try to get these teachings at this point in time, because you're battling these images from the past, right? And this is related to kind of these historical archetypes or pictures of who we were, you know, back when we were wearing breechcloths and teepees or wigwams, and we had these very, you know, more of like a romanticized version of ourselves, but they were perfect. And so it's like, now I'm so imperfect, right? And so that's what we have to deal with on a daily basis, at least when we start to kind of identify with our teachings and move in that place. And so if you're if you're practicing, or if you're sitting with Native people and Native clients, I hope you're particularly sensitive to that. The everyday battles of just being able to identify or be a Native person. And of course, you know, the history of land dispossession, displacement, removal kind of resulted in insult and separation of family, gender roles, and identity and personhood from what people were doing, right? If you're moved from your lands in this area to South Dakota, where there's not 10,000 or 11,000 lakes, like, how do you do that? Like, how you have to begin again, right? And traditionally, tribes from this region practice annual ceremonies. Hunting and gathering camps occurred around the calendar, the moon cycles, the stars, and what animals did. But there's also like a constant relationship and identity and dependence on the land, the sea, and natural resources, and that's how we exist. So Indigenous traditional knowledge provided that connected to the land, continuity of self, culture, identity, and then some folks will attest to like emotional regulation and healing, and that's even today. Like, if you're out there doing this work, whether it's fishing, whether it's, you know, gardening or harvesting, like, it's so mindful to feel that connection. So where to put the resources? Like, how do we figure out where to allocate resources in this day? You know, and I think most importantly, it's resource allocation to combat the legacy of colonial violence, you know, which is translational of traditional knowledge as a means to promote climate change adaptation, you know, and that's where we need to help direct our resources. And also mitigating, you know, that goes along with mitigating the weakening of traditional knowledge systems and community as a result of rapid acculturation, assimilationist policies, cultural discontinuity, historical law systems, and again, as I kind of talked about earlier, like rapid environmental changes is causing the weakening of these systems. So we'll go briefly, a lot of people already know this, in terms of decolonization, work and indigenous ways of knowing is like settler colonialism. You know, there was three components. It was dispossession, dependence, and oppression, right? And it's important for us to recognize that indigenous people combat these forces every day of their lives. You know, is if you identify as native, you identify with the land. Therefore, you recognize that you've been displaced from the land, you've been historically oppressed, and you are no longer dependent on the land. You know, you're dependent on other things, whether that's commodity foods or whether that's substance use, right? Or whether that's, you know, the federal government. So, yeah, just briefly, you know, when we think about these three components, we can look at kind of the impacts in the federal, like, U.S. and Indian policies that were enacted, you know, which resulted in kind of boarding school or residential school programs, forced removal from homelands, denial of land rights, cession of lands, placed on, you know, internment camps. So a lot of our reservations in the area, they'll be called agencies or forts or something like that. And in California, they're called missions. And so, yeah, cultural and spiritual ways were systematically oppressed and prohibited. You know, language was forbidden to be spoken in many spaces. And there was like a profound nutrition transition where we went from hunting and gathering to, you know, obviously that being prohibited to then going to like food rations. And now they're commodity foods. But then you see this huge proliferation of diabetes, obesity. And if you go to many Indian Health Service hospitals, what you'll find there is a clinic or a department that's specifically focused on renal failure from diabetes, you know. And so it didn't start like that, you know, the Indian Health Service, but because of the nature of this nutrition transition as a result of history, like colonialism, now we have people that need to, because of renal failure, they need to go to these, and diabetes, they need to go to these clinics. And the word is blanking on me right now. I can't, you know, it's called, I don't know. I'm not going to think about it. I'll think about it later, I'm sure. So community infrastructure is also dependent on federal funding. You know, we think about the Indian Health Service, which is chronically underfunded, funded under rates of the VA, the federal prison system, you know, per capita. So one famous saying for the Indian Health Service is life or limb. You know, if you've got a cold, don't go to the IHS, you know, only if, and they're not, you know, unfortunately, there's a lot of cases now where there's medical malpractice. They have a history of sterilization of Native women, you know. And so in my family, my grandmother's sister was sterilized at an Indian Health Service. So she consent, because a man came with her, her brother came with her, so that would have been my great uncle. They sought consent from him, but the problem is that he couldn't read. And so you see that these practices, you know, this is even into the 1950s, you know, 1950s and 60s, they sterilize, you know, Indigenous and Native women. So again, the Bureau of Indian Education, Bureau of Indian Affairs. So here, you know, this gives you a little bit of a portrait of actually the eras here. First, it was like termination, you know, then it was assimilation. But I think the name, or at least the saying, was kill the Indian and save the man. And so you see some of the U.S. and Indian, our Native Indigenous kind of policies and laws that they enacted. And so I should have given like a a trigger warning before this, because this is always hard to present on, and I wish I could leave it out, but geez, this is one in particular where I feel like I really needed to just put it in. And so you can see here, like, you know, Native people we didn't get citizenship until 1924, and we couldn't overtly, outwardly practice our religions, our spiritualities until 1978. And I was born in 1984. So it's crazy to me to think that 6 years before I was born, we had to hide. We had to hide, you know, these connections. We had to hide our ceremonies. We had to hide who we were, essentially, you know. And so as a result, you know, this is just one model of looking at trauma, stress, coping, and health outcomes. And so when we look at kind of historical trauma, discrimination, and traumatic life events, physical and sexual assaults and abuse, you know, they go through these kind of moderating factors or cultural buffers, which is like identity attitudes, and level of enculturation, spiritual coping, traditional health practices. And to the extent that these are strong or weak, it affects the relationship or the predisposition or proclivity or our tendency to experience these health risks. And so you see it's important you know, in terms of prevention, whether it's, you know, primary or secondary or tertiary, to supplement and really put resources towards reinforcing these cultural buffers. All right. And so the problem, as I see it in our work, is that psychology has severe cultural limitations. You know, nearly all of the research is drawn from, like, you know, non-native people, or we're in the other category, or we're erased altogether. You know, so, and conventional mental health treatment is seen as like incongruent for many Native people. I just realized I haven't taken a drink in like an hour and a half. So mental health practices, in that sense, and I guess in that way, are believed to represent like another form of assimilative technology. And so going back to the location exercise, it's like, how do I champion these efforts? You know, cultural revitalization, cultural continuity, helping people realize their connection to the land, you know, because that's who we are, that's our sense of being. We're also not like proselytizing or like practicing this like hegemony or of these devices to hurt people, continue to hurt people or colonize people, right? And that's a very real, I think, question that people are grappling with. And so we see that like iterations of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders and state mandates exacerbate this problem by reinforcing these politics of assimilation, like the validation of instruments, right? If you're doing, you know, if you're doing a clinical assessment for a learning disorder, or maybe you're looking at gifted and talented, or maybe you're looking at getting someone an individualized education plan in the schools. Oftentimes the states will say, you can only give these batteries, you can only give these IQ measures, you can only give these screeners. And so what does that say? You know, so I was with an intern like 2 weeks ago, and we're going over the normative kind of stats, the norms of this, like what's called the wide range achievement test. It's achievement inventory. So if you're looking at a learning disability in a child, you have to give a cognitive measure to measure their, you know, IQ, and then you have to give an achievement measure. And if there's a discrepancy between those, you know that maybe it's in math, reading, or writing, you know that, oh, this child's like, they're smart, but they're behind in reading, and they're doing great in math and writing. So then, you know, they would qualify for a disorder of reading. But anyway, you see how that's an issue, and especially in maybe child protection, you know, thus like the Indian Child Welfare Act and stuff like that. But, and then there's cultural misconceptions of what is normal, you know. Cultural conceptualizations of health and wellness is grounded in relationship and place, going unacknowledged, and instead focusing on conceptualizations of illness and health from a wellness or a Western perspective. And what comes to mind in particular in this is, you know, this in like the developmental psychopathology literature, we talk about resilience in adverse childhood experiences. But resilience is very much like a pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Like, you have one good parent, you're smart, you know, why can't you do this? Like, how come you're not any better at this? Like, you should be able to do this stuff. But it completely disregards the history of a person, the strength of culture, and the strength of community. Will also, I think, really just kind of not recognizing that it's the same institutions that have oppressed people, and those are the reasons why people are hurt, right? And so it's like stuff like that, when you read like the resilience literature, like we have to be really mindful of what this is saying about people. It's very individualistic, you know. And there's some folks that are writing on like indigenous concepts of resilience, which is pretty fun to read. And it seems to like remedy a lot of that. And so just kind of briefly, I think going into this is like one saying that we use all the time, and like when I go home for ceremony with like my dad's family, is like mataku yase. And so it's all of my relations, like acknowledging that everybody and all things are related, right? And so in this way, like we think about like one-on-one counseling approaches run at odds with traditional cultural expectations in the worldview. And so when we think about this, and, you know, just this simple saying and belief is that the best place to develop and initiate programs is at the community level. You know, so many problems at the individual level require family or community level interventions. And also, like, spirituality plays a critical role in healing at the interaction between feelings, thoughts, and behavior. You know, you think about, you know, especially in our communities, that our bodies are just, you know, really a vessel. And so our like true person, our true being is that of a spirit, right? And so we see these in the animals, we see these in the plants, we see this in the water, we see this in the rocks, we see this in the air, the wind, you know, all of that. And so in that way, it really helps us understand like our place is not above anything. It's really just existing alongside. Land-based healing reinforces the connection to the environment. And so this, you know, going back to this medicine wheel, and that's how we organize ourselves spiritually and emotionally and physically and mentally around kind of wellness and concepts of wellness. So, and this was a really cool study. So I really appreciated this, is that, you know, what they did is, a friend of mine is, he's a psychologist, and his name is John Gonzalez. He works at Bemidji State, along with some of his other colleagues, and Melissa Walls, she's also works up in Duluth. But they did a cool study, like, what does it mean? Does it mean to kids to live in a good way? And so they did this in like Ojibwe or Anishinaabe communities in Minnesota and Canada. And what they realized is a lot of those kids said it means like living, being a cultural person, you know, learning and using language, like taking care of elders, doing this and doing that. But then they tied it back to these 7 traditional teachings. You know, it is like honesty, living with honesty, living respectfully, living a life of like humility, like living a life of like loving other beings, like being in those things, and like using wisdom, bravery, courage, and truth. Like, so these are like traditional teachings, you know, and of course it's hard to live and abide by these on a daily basis, but that's where you try to seek balance. And it's so important that families help kids develop in this way to be able to achieve kind of these milestones and to be able to display some of these character traits. Briefly, we have about 20 minutes left, 30. Cultural connectedness then, you know, as we can see, is so vital and so important, you know, and so this, you know, author, Rod McCormick, like he's an Indigenous author and therapist and counseling professor from Canada. Basically, he would say that teaching a traditional culture is a successful way of facilitating healing, and that, you know, there's several studies that have found positive relationships between cultural connectedness and wellness within Indigenous peoples. But there's also interesting like moderating factors involved. And one of the articles that I've read, I guess the goal of the article was to look at culture as a social determinant of health and whether culture was protective. And what they looked at were hunting, were a number of things. And so cultural connectedness, some of the studies that I've read usually look at like traditional activities, like do you hunt, do you gather, do you garden, do you harvest, do you do that? And then traditional ceremonies, like do you practice traditional spiritual ceremonies? And then like identity, like cultural identity, do you, you know, speak your language and stuff like that. But in this one, it's kind of a ways back, it's from 2002, but what they found was that people in these remote communities in Canada were hunting a lot more than their counterparts in the city. And so it's like, yeah, that's obvious. But it wasn't for the reason that they had hypothesized. They had hypothesized that hunting is going to be an important component and protective factor for someone's health. But what they found was that some of the folks that hunted had, in fact, worse health. And so when they went back and they looked at the data and stuff like that, and what they basically were able to glean from that was that it's likely that people, because of poverty, are having to hunt to live, right? So, you know, there's a number of things that you could say about that, but basically it's kind of, you know, we can't use like this approach, like we have to critically examine what this means for our people, for our communities, when we try to like intervene in these ways, because we're still existing in this like colonial system, right? And I think at the bottom of that, that's the root issue. So in another study, what they said was there's also moderating factors involved, which is historical loss and perceived discrimination. And so when they looked at like when they looked at culture as health, the health again, and another study was like not what they had hoped for, right? And so they're like, man, these people are practicing their cultural, but their health is just not where we were hypothesizing again. But what they found was that these people also scored higher or had like subjective kind of reviews or I don't know how to say this, but they were basically scored higher on these like measures of historical loss and perceived discrimination. So yeah, I know my culture, but because of that, I also know how much I've lost. And I also know how much people don't like me or see me as like a Native person, or how I perceive myself, or how people are mistreated, and how the inequities, the issues that we face, the violence, the discrimination, so that really depresses the ability for us to utilize culture as a strength in some ways. But basically, it doesn't mean that it isn't helpful. And I think that's the takeaway point, is that, right now, the big push is to utilize like culture as treatment, as healing. And so resilience from this perspective includes the strengths of community, culture, and land. All right. So this is just reiterating the point, but when we talk about decolonization, it's like really the land and ceremony and reconnecting. And what does that mean? It's like giving back the land. That's what it means. You know, it means not in any small way. It's not taking down like Columbus statues. It's not anything like that, but that's a small symbol of hope. And so, you know, one thing I liked about, you know, appreciated and really connected to through all of the past month or 2 months in Minneapolis after the George Floyd murder is that, you know, there was Indigenous people saying, hey, the original looting, you know, happened when this land was taken, you know, and people were murdered and people were killed and people were, you know, that's when the original looting happened. And also discussing, you know, spiritual and cultural artifacts in museums, you know, and so that's another issue that we grapple with, is that these things were stolen, these things were taken, you know, and so we can call ourselves whatever, archaeologists, whatever we want to, but you know, the fact is that they're not yours, you know, those belong to families, and so. Yeah. So again, here, land, I think just to wrap it all up, is vital to the healing relationship to others and ourselves, and the ceremony is the device that kind of communicates this need, that the land holds us and supports us as Indigenous people. And so if you must, you know, practice kind of, you know, Western methods, I find it's really helpful to look at like mindfulness tools to connect. And I think Native people have a long history of a lot of the ceremonies are kind of grounded in mindfulness and connecting with kind of creation. And again, also, you know, CBT, when you add like attachment theory to it, it really helps us understand the kind of how our difficulty attachments have come to be, right? With our primary caretakers or, you know, object relations and stuff like that. And attachment theories from Indigenous perspectives, especially focusing on like identity as manifested across time with ancestors and families and communities. And also like narrative approaches to cultural identity formation and historical trauma, you know, and this is where adding genograms are consistent with remembering and asking elders about family. So you see some of these tools are useful to be able to help reinforce kind of that connection and relationship to family and community. So just basic, this is very brief, space and place. So a bit about land-based healing. So this was a quote that was particularly kind of profound for me, I guess, is if colonization is fundamentally about dispossessing Indigenous peoples from land, decolonization must involve forms of education that reconnect Indigenous peoples to the land and the social relations, knowledges, and languages that arise from the land. You know, and of course, as I said before, settler colonialism is functioning to assimilate Indigenous peoples, separating them from these sources of strength. So as a social movement, like land-based pedagogy, you're teaching this, you know, initiatives to get back to the land is, you know, one of the articles that I looked at in this really cool journal was about what they called like Minneapolis treaties. And so it was basically like, you know, we're reestablishing and reclaiming this treaty or this agreement with the earth by going to this special place in Canada and harvesting manoomin with our family and our community every year. You know, it helps us kind of get back in touch with these forms of being, these forms of thinking, and these like this governance. But it also acts in direct opposition to kind of Western forms of knowledge that seek to terminate Indigenous life and land claims. And so again, here, ecological connectedness promotes well-being and health, you know, going back to the cultural connectedness piece. And land-based activities honor generational and family connections, you know, and passing down oral histories. Okay, let me see. So examples, you know, some of the simple things that like I like to be involved in, or I would like in the case of salmon, but harvesting, you know, medicines, you know, sage, cedar, maple syrup, again here, monoman or wild rice, salmon, deer, elk, or buffalo, being involved in traditional and spiritual activities. Yeah. So basically, essentially, you know, any act of gathering medicine or harvesting involves ceremony, you know, and any person who's indigenous or native, most, you know, will know this. And the tough thing is, if you have the privilege of this knowledge, is passing it down or bringing it to our community members or clients in a gentle way, because we remember how we felt when we didn't know this, you know, and what does that say about us as people if we don't know this stuff, you know? And so I think that's the gap that we have to bridge with community members when we're privileged to know some of these things. So again, why are we here? You know, and I'm not going to do this because we're running out of time. This was an exercise I was going to do. What do we think, you know, with this uncomfortable presence of thoughts, questioning the utility of these tools that we've been using, or maybe we don't use, to help Indigenous people on a day-to-day basis? What comes up for us? You know, what is the difference between these notions of theory helping and those that we were taught in our educational institutions? And how can we champion these efforts moving forward, not just for Indigenous people, but ourselves? You know, whether that's gardening, getting in the backyard. Now, I know it's difficult because I live in a small apartment, you know, so gardening is something that's hard, but I consider, you know, taking care of my dog kind of my way of, you know, his name actually happens to be Earth. So anyway, yeah, advocacy, volunteering, gardening, getting on boards, school boards, all that stuff, you know, changing the, again, going from this, you know, changing the materials in our schools to be able to teach this to kids, having language, and of course, location. You know, finally, we return back to where we started, is that challenges to decolonizing work and land-based healing is this idea of like pan-Indianism, right? It's not a one-size-fits-all approach, right? It's not a standard measure that we can apply the same type of healing mechanism to all Native people and expect it to work. And I think this is the fallacy in all of the things that we do. You know, when we get a grant or we get money or we get something, it's like, let's just use the medicine wheel. Let's just do this. Let's just do X, Y, Z. Let's, you know, let's have a sweat lodge. Let's, you know, that doesn't work. Like there's 574 federally recognized tribes. That doesn't include those that are unrecognized or seeking recognition. And there's like 600 plus First Nations in Canada. You know, so it's incumbent upon the people that are invested in this work to also invest the time in figuring out what the work actually is and what's meaningful to the people, and collaborating with the communities and holding up those knowledges that they have. Again, conflicts with Western Eurocentric positive thought and epistemologies. And most importantly, I think people are at such varied levels of cultural identity and connectedness, and this comes with a lot of feelings and sentiments. And we as teachers or co-learners are at varied levels of identity and connectedness. And it's such a hard thing to let go of that ego involved in this process and just learn as be learners, you know? And again, threats by land theft, environmental contamination, and colonial gender violence. Now, I didn't talk too much about gender, only because it's really hard, I think, as a man to go into this space in particular and talk about the effects or how, you know, like Ojibwe or Dakota ways involve women, but there's very important teachings about that. And I really hope that, there's women and elders that are able to provide these teachings in this space, in this echo, to be able to elaborate on these things, because I think it's so important. But as a man, I know that, not learning things and seeing the results of like substance abuse in our communities, absentee fathers, all of this stuff, we are not any different from our community members. So I think that's most important. And I think that sets the stage for a collaborative and cooperative relationship with community members, is saying like, I've been through my own stuff. Like, I'm still learning and I don't know everything. So, definitely I think patriarchy, Christianity, and colonialism all together, whether it was the doctrine of discovery or manifest destiny, rooted in colonialism, I think those things have really wreaked havoc on our gender roles and the realization of our communities and structures of our communities. And so I think, that could be a whole presentation in itself. And I would be so happy to learn from someone who kind of was able to go into that in depth. Again, locating ourselves and positionality become important in this work. Where we are from, how did we get here, with what knowledge, and who do we come from and where, again. And this should be explicitly stated when doing this work, especially when coming to a community from a position of power, whether or not you're a doctor, whether or not you're, there's definitely positions that we come from where, we have power on our hands. If you work with child protection, I just got off the phone with someone today that's like, I don't know if they're going to take my brother away. We're like drawing ninjas, sharing a screen on this whiteboard, and it's like, there's a prairie care van with cops in the car, and it's like, they just took my sister in that car the other day. I don't know why they're here again, right? And so it's like, maybe that social worker or whatever was well-meaning. I don't know what the visit was about, but it's like, there's definitely power when you come with, whether it's a gun or handcuffs or a clipboard, or you come from any institution. So in conclusion, I think the practice of land-based healing, and for us to help promote this, is in direct opposition to colonial violence. And most, if not all, disorder or dis-ease in our communities can be organized around like settler colonial systems and institutions. And, from what I've learned about social determinants of health, this is what we call them. It's like, we have a fancy, cute name for them, is that these are the social ills and inequities that determine poor health in our communities. And all of these are like systems of lack for Indigenous people. And so, and it's no secret now that adaptation to climate change and the health of Indigenous people involve the acknowledgement and utilization of traditional knowledge systems. Only because it's like, as Native people, who we are is, identity. Our identity is, cannot be divorced from the land, and like that, this is us. That's who we are. We're part of creation. And so investing in healing within Indigenous communities is an investment to healing the land, and this has critical implications for evidence-based practice, right? How do we kind of bring this to the floor at, who knows, whether it's SAMHSA or the American Psychological Association or the American Psychiatric Association, who, publishes our statistical manual of mental disorders, our diagnostic materials, and like, we're having trouble even getting historical trauma or like developmental trauma disorder kind of something. It's like, how do you recognize something like this, that trauma to the land has caused like hurt to the people, right? And so there's a lot of challenges, but I think at the ground level, at the community level, there's a lot of hope. So that's it. Miigwech. Thank you everybody for being here, and I guess we're going to open it up for questions for a little bit. Is that right?
Yeah, Colin, thank you
Okay,
so
let me
much.
stop sharing, and then I'll.
My brain is spinning.
I'm not sure how to.
You stop
Do I
sharing.
unmute you? I think you're on mute, Rebecca, or.
No, I'm not. They can hear me.
I can't hear you.
Somebody had asked.
Yeah, I guess we're just gonna do questions. I can't. Hold on.
Can you hear my question?
Kyle, can you hear Sherry?
Sorry, my I have this nice Bluetooth speaker that they got me, and it was off. So yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay.
Someone had asked if they have some more questions. Is there an email that they can email to ask the questions?
Yeah, let me put it in the chat box here. So you can email me at kyle.hill@indianhealthboard.com. So right there, or you can email me at 29@jh.edu.
Kyle, we also had a question about books to do more reading and to learn more about some of these subjects. Do you have anything that you recommend? Yeah,
I think that the one that really helped me to understand the depth of the kind of violence, I guess, was a book by someone called Russell Thornton, and it's from 1987, and it's called The American Indian Holocaust and Survival. And so it was like a really comprehensive picture of one, starting from the theory that we went on like this land bridge, like the Bering Strait theory or whatever it was, and kind of breaking that down to, when like epidemics in our communities, which I didn't even visit, but I mean, the history of like smallpox and tuberculosis, all that stuff, straight through like reservations and missions and stuff like that. But I think that's a really good one. And then there's like, what other books are good? Geez, I'll have to maybe I could do a list, and you have my references too. Like that's a good place to really visit too. I think that's what I was thinking. You have such a good list of references. Are there any other questions?
And her.
Anyone want to just unmute yourself and say something? Well, I just want to say thank you, Kyle. Thank you so much. I'm excited that we had so many people here and they got to hear this, and that I think a lot of us will be doing additional, we'll be learners, right? We're going to keep working at this. I want to let everyone know that we're looking forward to another presentation in August, and this the plan is that it will be Colin Cash from the White Earth Reservation. He's going to talk about his work with Sober Squad and how it's a movement that's been spreading, and it's in many states now and many squads, and he wants to talk to us about how it's addressing that relationship piece to healing. And I'm excited about that one too. And then in September, we're looking forward to another presentation from American Indian Family Center, and we'll get details to you. So I hope that you all have put in your attendance and name, organization, email in the chat. I think Sherry has found everyone, and we'll be sending you an evaluation survey shortly, if not yet this afternoon. It'll be tomorrow morning, and be sure to let us know if you need continuing education on that survey. If nothing else, then I'm ready to let us finish. Kyle, anything else you'd like to say?
Oh, just grateful for everyone here, and I just that's the longest I've talked for a really long time.
Good job.
Drinks.
Remember to drink water.
Yeah,
All
yeah.
right. Bye-bye. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you.